everyone, welcome back. Or if you're just joining, my name is Maya and welcome to my channel, Cranley Place, where I'm posting content on scarf style, knot tutorials, and more. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to be notified of new videos, which I'm publishing weekly. One of you recently asked me about the Hermès surtient, or dip dye scarves, and specifically about dip dyeing a vintage scarf on your own. That got me thinking to maybe give it a whirl myself. I've dyed other things, so why not one of my vintage Hermès scarves? In this video, I'll share my experience, and you can see how the scarf turned out. What do you think? Success or fail? Let's take a look. I don't recall when Hermès first introduced the dip dye concept, but I want to say it's maybe been around for a decade or more. If one of you can remember, please let me know in the comments. I do know that since its introduction, Hermès has offered dip dye in all kinds of formats, from the 90s to the 140 centimeters and more recently 70 centimeters. I can't say that I've ever seen a dip dyed Twilly or 45 centimeter from Hermès, so that may be something to consider if you have a vintage scarf in one of these sizes where you want to try this yourself. Anyways, I have one dip dye. Actually, I bought this on eBay. It's called Aloha by Laurence Beausomieux and in a saturated orange, which is a fantastic neutral that I wear both by itself and paired with other scarves. If you haven't seen my tutorial on the scarf pairing, be sure to check that out. This originally had an Hermès surtient tag on it, which I promptly removed, and you can tell that this was a sale scarf by the stamp here in the corner. Given the intensity of the color, I didn't really care about that since you can't see it when it's worn. Two things I really like about dip dye scarves. First is the color saturation. In the Aloha dip dye, the design itself took on some very dark forest green, almost teal tones, with of course browns, rust colors, and various shades of orange, obviously. In fact, this same design and dip dye color combo is one that was offered on Hermes.com as recently as earlier this year. The second thing I'll note is the softness, and in this regard, it does remind me of the wash scarves. The dip dyes have what I'll call quite a soft hand to them. If you've handled a new Hermès scarf, you'll know that the silk typically has a crispness to it, and only after a while of wearing does it start to soften and relax. The dip dye feels like an Hermès scarf that you've had for years, which gives it quite a graceful drape when wearing it. You may recall the Hermesmatic dip dye pop-ups from about 5 years ago, where Hermès basically took this concept on tour, visiting several cities around the world, from Europe to Japan, the UAE, and multiple cities here in the US. The pop-up was conceptualized as a laundromat where you could bring your vintage Hermès scarves to be dip dyed in select colors and/or buy a new scarf, specifically for dip dyeing. Although personally, I don't think I'd buy one just to dye it immediately, but to each his or her own. I don't know if there was a limit on how many scarves you could bring in, at least for evaluation, but they did have to be Hermès. A textile expert would then assess the scarves, and if suitable, you could then choose to have it dyed in one of three colors, at that time denim blue, a fuchsia pink, or violet. They did say that based on the age of the scarf, the dye would behave differently, with vintage scarves typically becoming more saturated, while a new one would hold more of the original colors of the base scarf. For my dip dyeing, I used the sink method simply out of consideration for my family, who probably wouldn't appreciate having a dye residue on their clothes. But the fact that these Hermès pop-ups did use washing machines made me a bit less fearful about perhaps throwing a scarf in sometime on a delicate cycle. We'll see if I can get over that hump. So what scarf did I choose and why? In this case, I chose a scarf called Les Clés, or The Keys, by Cathy Latam. She is another longtime designer for Hermès. Les Clés was her first design with the house, coming out in 1965 and having been reissued multiple times since. If you're familiar with the design, at its center it features an 18th century embroidered purse surrounded by dozens of keys. I'm sure it won't surprise you that the purse itself was part of the Émile Hermès collection, which has inspired many a cachet design and continues to do so even today. And the keys were inspired by models in the collections of Émile Hermès and the Musée de la Sec des Tournelles, which is a museum devoted to the art of wrought ironwork in Rouen. In fact, 47 pieces are arranged in a circle around the embroidered purse. Each is authentic with its own story and a testament to the extraordinary workmanship of the artisan silver and goldsmiths who made them. One opened the doors of Notre Dame. Another was presented to the governor of the Low Countries under the name of Charles III. The bows, or the rounded tops of the keys, take the form of lyres, or open books, arabesques, or elaborate intertwining scrolls, while the complexity of the web, the bottom part, designed to turn in the lock, hints at the important secrets each protects. Le Clé was one of the early designs in my collection, and I've always loved not only the intricacy of the keys, but the silk cords and tassels that mimic the curves of the keys. Now, I happen to have two of this scarf in the same colorway, one of which belonged to my mom. In fact, we bought them around the same time, and I always figured maybe to hang one of them as wall art someday. But for both of us, the scarves have always been something you should wear and enjoy. And guess what? Stuff happens, and specifically spills happen. So, besides being a duplicate in my collection, one of the scarves does have some stains which we were never able to lift out. I'm not sure if this is mine or my mom's. The larger stain looks like soy sauce to me, and while I have always been the messier eater, notoriously messy, in fact, it could have been either one of us. But that is why this is a great candidate for dip dyeing. If I had made it to the Hermesmatic pop-up back in 2017, this was on my list to bring in for consideration. But frankly, I was too lazy to make the drive, so here we are. RIT dye is pretty commonly available here in the US, and I think it's also sold in Europe, but not too sure about Asia. Dylon is another one you may come across, which I believe is specifically designed for use in washers. But at any rate, I chose this brand because I could get it locally, and I've used it successfully for other craft projects. One thing I also like is that on the RIT website, they have a whole catalog of how to mix their basic dyes to make other colors. If you haven't seen this, it is pretty handy. Based on my scarf being mainly white, blue, and gold, I thought I would move sideways on the color wheel into the purple range, and specifically either an aubergine or burgundy. Why? Well, first, these are colors that I like. Second, it'll work well across my wardrobe. And finally, either one would also pair quite nicely with many of my other scarves. So after perusing their catalog, I landed on one they called Sweet Sangria, which is a combination of two dye colors, wine and camel. And as luck would have it, they had both in stock at my local craft store, so I didn't have to order online. To achieve this specific color calls for a ratio of 3/4 of the wine dye to 1/4 of the camel color. I got both of these in liquid form, and note that the recipe would change slightly if using powder-based dye. So first, I pre-wash the fabric by hand. They recommend this for anything you'd want to dye, plus you want the fabric to be uniformly damp when it goes into the dye bath. For most fabrics, this would be to a recommended temperature of at least 140 degrees Fahrenheit. RIT actually recommends a higher temperature range than this for natural fabrics, including cotton, linen, and silk, 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, in fact. But out of caution, I kept my dye bath on the cooler side so as not to damage the fabric. For every pound of dry fabric, the instructions say to use 4 ounces of dye per 3 gallons of the hottest water that's safe for the fabric. And to be honest, I've never followed these guidelines precisely, but I did want to be more diligent about doing so in this case. Anyways, it's one scarf, and you remember how much an Hermès scarf weighs, right? 65 grams or 2.3 ounces. So not worried there. There should be enough color in the bath to pretty well saturate the scarf. They also recommend that there's enough room for the fabric to move freely in the dye bath. Then 2 other instructions, and this first one applies to any dye bath, and that's to add a teaspoon of liquid dish detergent. This helps promote uniform color results. Then specifically when dyeing nylon, silk, or wool, to add a cup of vinegar. For cotton, nylon, or linen, that would be a cup of salt instead. Other dye manufacturers recommend less. And in either case, the vinegar or salt acts as a mordant or dye fixative that helps the fibers absorb the dye. Once the dye bath was ready, I tested the color with a paper towel, then into the dye bath with a pre-washed damp scarf. This is the point in the dyeing process when I think of Shakespeare's song of the witches from Macbeth. You know, the double, double, toil and trouble, that one. You can imagine you've got 10 to 30 minutes of dye time, keeping a pretty constant stir, so you've got plenty of time to think of all sorts of silly things. Incidentally, this also reminds me of making caramel, which is a pretty labor-intensive process as well with all the stirring. But let's see if the results of this dip dye bath turn out sweet. Fast forward 30 minutes, and it was time to take the baby out of the bath. After removing it from the dye bath, you have to rinse the fabric with cool water. Again, I did this in the kitchen sink until the water runs clear. Once it's clear, it's time to remove the excess water. Since this is silk, I use the same method as when I hand wash a scarf, which is basically not to wring the fabric. I lay it flat on a towel and roll it, squeezing the towel as I roll. That removes most of the water, and you're left with a slightly damp scarf. At this point, I hang it to air dry and then carefully iron when it's nearly dry. So how did it turn out? Admittedly, it was a little scary dropping it into the dye bath since there was no turning back at that point, but overall, I have to say I'm pretty pleased with how the scarf turned out. The sweet sangria dye color turned the borders quite a deep purple, almost eggplant color, whereas the rest of the scarf pretty much took on that sangria color as expected. When photographed by itself, the scarf almost reads like a bronze color, but when worn, it seems more purple. Maybe it's just me. If I had to do it again, I would probably double the dye in order to intensify the color. And just for giggles, I may go back and re-dye this one now that I've gotten past that initial fear of putting an Hermès scarf into a dye bath in the first place. Would I do it again? I think the answer is yes, especially with a vintage scarf that you may have tired of or want to rejuvenate. Or maybe it's a scarf that you found in the secondary market that was a great price, but you're having second thoughts about the color palette. Overall, I'm pleased with my experience and feel comfortable that I would do it again. So there you have it, my DIY surtient or dip dyeing of my vintage Hermès scarf. Please like the video if you enjoyed it and let me know what you think in the comments. In future episodes, I'll share other scarf reviews, not tutorials, and more, so be sure to hit that subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks again for joining me today. Until next time.